as someone who used to be the Attorney General and served in that role, what was your reaction when you looked at some of these communications?
I was quite surprised. It's not an experience I had as Attorney General. I was never asked by the legislature to advise them on how to pass a law that violates the Constitution. To the contrary, when we went over to talk to the legislature about proposed legislation that was unconstitutional or problematic, we would have a conversation with them behind closed doors and say, look, you got a problem. This is why, what we think the problem is. For example, we think your bill violates the Constitution, and you might want to rethink it because it could invite a court challenge. And that was how we interacted. Keep in mind that the legislature has its own attorneys,
Right.
and under the doctrine of separation of powers, they're the legislative branch. Attorney General is part of the executive branch, which means it's you know part of the process of executing the laws.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that the legislature can't ask for advice. That's fine, and the AG office will provide it. But I had not seen before this week an example of the AG office actively collaborating with a legislative sponsor on how to draft a bill that could get the Constitution basically reinterpreted and 95 years of precedent overturned.
Right. I think the other thing that's interesting, and I'm curious about your thoughts on, is that Jamie Pearson sent a draft of the bill to Solicitor General Noah Purcell. Purcell sent an email back with some feedback, but at the very end he said, oh, by the way, I noted that there's not an emergency clause. If you don't put one in, someone could run a referendum against it. So
Yeah,
he's not saying, hey, this needs an emergency clause because you're going to need this money right away because the taxes
right.
are being collected for years. And so he's saying to put this in so that voters don't get to weigh in this November. What was your reaction to that?
Again, it's surprising for a couple reasons. Number one, a bill that's necessary for the support of state government doesn't require an emergency clause to avoid a referendum challenge. That's why the state budget cannot be subjected to a referendum when the budget passes, right? I was surprised that the Solicitor General either didn't know that or didn't acknowledge it or wanted the belts and suspenders of an emergency clause as well as the language that says it's necessary to support the government. Number two, why is he providing this advice? Is it because he's decided he wants to support policy, be involved in policy making and not, providing straight up legal advice? I don't know. It was just surprising. Again, I haven't seen that happen before.
Yeah, it seems like the Attorney General's office is where they would go and say, "Hey, I want this bill to survive legal scrutiny. Could you
Yes.
provide some legal advice? What do you think's problematic
Well,
about this bill or something like that?" And then
yeah, yeah,
the attorneys or legal counsel say, "Here's where you might get into trouble. This is what we suggest you do." And then also,
right.
the
And
Attorney General's office
yeah,
attorneys were saying, "Don't call it an excise tax, or else the
right.
Supreme Court can't be for." I mean, it seems really weird for them
Yeah.
for it to be saying we want to force a separate branch of government. We want to force them to do something.
Right. So TJ, the reason we have an elected attorney general in our state, an office established in the state constitution, is to have an independent officer and office that will defend the Constitution and the laws of the state. So, getting into the role of strategizing with a legislator on how to get around the Constitution, it just isn't right. It should not be done. Secondly, there was something noticeably absent, I think, from the records you took. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in the documents you posted that I reviewed, I didn't see anyone saying, "Hey, this proposed income tax you want, Senator, can be constitutional. You just have to do what every legislature before you has done since 1933, which is to put the votes together for a constitutional amendment, then send that to the voters, and the voters can vote on it." That's happened 6 times, starting in 1934, the year after the Colton decision.
Right.
Uh, no one said that, right? At least I didn't see any
I
documents.
think what's also interesting is he's what he's implying is if there's a referendum, voters would overturn it.
Well, exactly. I mean, the legislature, the legislative leadership here did everything they could and are doing everything they can to keep this law, this bill away from the voters. unlike all the legislatures before them that said, okay, the public already amended the Constitution to create the broadest possible definition of income. It picks up every form of intangible property, literally everything intangible subject to ownership.
Right.
And of course, ownership is a hallmark of property. I'm waiting to hear the Solicitor General, the Attorney General, the governor, the legislative sponsors explain why people don't own their incomes, why they don't have a property interest in their incomes. That's going to be a
Yeah, 'cause I was
very
looking
interesting point.
Yeah, I was looking through the legal memo that they sent Governor Ferguson's office, and they argue, they point to other states that do not treat income as property, but the issue there is that we put in a constitutional amendment that has the
Right.
broadest definition of property.
That's right.
In the 1930 voter pamphlet for the 14th Amendment explicitly states that the reason that they need this amendment is so that they can tax income at a
Bingo.
separate rate than
Right.
land, because this was in the middle of the Great Depression, property values
Right.
falling, and that had been the bulk of where they were getting the revenue. So they said,
Yep.
we want to tax income, but it needs to be at a separate rate because you don't tax income at, like you don't a 9.9% tax on property would be
Here's a thought. Maybe the sponsors of Amendment 14 realized that if they said this will allow income to be taxed, people wouldn't be as excited about it. And instead, they just focused on income from stocks and bonds. But they, as you point out, it was income.
Yeah,
And there's no question that the amendment encompasses income because we have one of the two broadest definitions of property in America. We don't have to have them forever. We can amend our Constitution, for example, to exclude income from that definition of property, which currently says everything intangible subject to ownership.
right.
And there have been 6 efforts to do that, 6 separate constitutional amendments that would have done something like that, that would have allowed one way or another a progressive income tax. And the voters rejected all of them. The last time was when Dan Evans was governor, and voters rejected a proposal 77% to 23%, right?
Yeah.
So that's it is interesting that, and disappointing that legislative leaders and now the Attorney General's office seem to be working so hard to keep this issue away from the voters. I think it's quite revealing. So, we'll see what the courts think.
I'm curious also because there was a supplemental brief that was filed after my story broke in the lawsuit against the bills. People who filed a referendum and it was denied because of the emergency clause. Well, these emails show that the emergency clause was put there explicitly to prevent a referendum rather than because it was necessary to fund the budget. So
Yeah, to be clear, it's not an emergency clause. An emergency clause is this bill takes effect immediately and is necessary for public safety and health. That's an emergency clause. This is the other way to
okay.
keep a bill away from a referendum vote. Also in the same part of the Constitution that lays out the referendum power. And it's the part that says that measures that are necessary for the support of state government are also exempt.
Okay.
So they used those words to get their exemption. But I think what the challengers to that decision are saying is, well, this tax isn't going to be collected until 2029.
Right.
So how is it necessary to support the budget? I think that's the argument they're going to be making.